Hello. Thank you for joining this month's Connect with Control M session. My name is Trinidad Gaitan, and I'll be your facilitator for this webinar. Today, we'll demonstrate authorizations in Control M 921, which have been moved from the Control M Configuration Manager to Control M Web. We have three presenters today from the Control M support team: Mike Ricani, Daniel Levy, and Drew Casas. We recommend going to full screen mode during this presentation by pressing the full screen button. For any questions you may have during the presentation, please post them in the Q&A pod. We will be addressing your questions at the end of the session. Today we'll demonstrate the topics that you see here: configure users and roles in Control M Web, manage authorizations via API, move roles between environments, configure LDAP, and then we'll conclude with a Q&A session. For our first demonstration, Mike will demonstrate how to configure users and roles in Control M Web. Mike, please go ahead.
Thanks for that introduction. Today we will be looking at some changes to the user authorization in Control M version 21. We will review the location of authorizations before Control M version 21, show how the authorizations have moved to the web interface, review roles and users in the web interface, and as user authorizations has changed in Control M version 21, we will look at a scenario where, as an administrator, we can manage users and roles.
Before Control M version 21, authorizations could be assigned at user level and at role level, as shown here in the Control M Configuration Manager for version 19. Click Security, click Authorizations, select Roles and edit a role to see the authorizations for that role. Click Users and edit a user to see the authorizations for that user. If you have compatibility mode set on after an in-place upgrade to Control M version 21, please note that you will still see this legacy method for authorizations. In Control M version 21, authorizations are managed through the web interface. They are no longer managed in the Control M Configuration Manager. Let's move to version 21. We are now in version 21 of the Configuration Manager. When compatibility mode is off, all users and roles previously defined are available in the web interface. Authorizations are no longer set in the Configuration Manager. The Authorization button, Security Authorizations, will take you to the web interface. You can also connect to the web interface using the Control M URLs shown here. Click Home, click Web Server URLs here. Let's connect to the web interface now. Click Login. I click Configuration, the orange drop down, and select Users. Click the orange drop down and select Roles. I can now see users and roles in my environment. Please note, in Control M version 21, authorization is now held in the role, not the user, which now only holds information relating to the specific user. Let's see that now. Click Users and select a user. Note there are two tabs, General and Access Control. In the General tab, we can see username, an optional description, roles assigned, and password expiration. Note the user must have a role assigned. Select Access Control. Access Control gives us a useful view for checking what authorizations and access a specific user will take. We can see this view is split into different areas which will be described in the next section about roles. Let's view the roles now. Cancel. Click roles to view roles. Please note there are three predefined roles. Administrator, which has full access to all functionalities. Team leader, which allows this role to manage permissions for any user assigned. And viewer, which is read-only access. You have the option to duplicate a role using the duplicate button here, or to add a new role using the add role button here and select a role. In the General tab, we can see the role name and description. If you are using IDP or LDAP groups, use the associated group field to associate a group to the Control M role. In the associated user field, an IDP or LDAP user can be associated to this Control M role. This will override the associated group setting. From the Interface Access drop-down list, you can select which Control M applications users assigned this role will have access to. Access to these interfaces can be turned off and on here. Let's have a look at the Access Control tab. Access Control has toggle switches for planning, monitoring, tools, configuration, and workflow insights, meaning the authorization can be turned on or off at this point. For example, by turning on the toggle for planning and clicking the drop-down arrow, we can see options to further tailor access via this role. Selecting folders and jobs, we can select a subset of folders the role will have access to. Note the access level drop-down list has the following levels. Browsers for read-only, update allows creation and editing, and full will also allow deletion. Let's say we need to create access for a user called Operator who monitors Control M jobs and has the ability to check output and rerun jobs if necessary. This user will also need full access to alerts. We'll create a role for this purpose and then assign a user to that role. First, we create the role. We will give a name to the role, Operator, a description. This role will be assigned an internal user, so I can leave these fields blank. Let's give this role access to the Control M client and the Control M web. Click the drop down and I'll turn off access to Automation API and the Control M Configuration Manager. Click the Access Control tab to give access to the monitoring domain. When we click the drop down and click Job Permissions, we can give further access to View and Actions. And in this drop down, I can remove authorization to delete jobs. Further tailoring can be performed by clicking the Filter button here. This role doesn't require filtering, so I'll delete here. I will also need full access to alerts. Let's toggle that on. Click the drop down arrow. And again, we have 3 levels of access. I require full access. Click Add to add the new role. And this will be shown in the view here. Now let's create an operator user and assign the new role to it. Click Users, click Add User. Enter username and a description. As discussed, this is an internal user, so I will not be filling in this field. Click the drop-down arrow for assigned roles and select our newly created role, operator. Add a password and optionally select the password expiration. Note there are no options for authorizations here as they've been added in the role. Click Add to add the user. Our user, operator 001, is now visible. Please note you cannot create a user in Control-M version 21 without assigning a role to that user. Now back to you, Trini.
Thank you, Mike, for showing how to use Control-M Web to configure users and roles. In our next demo, Daniel will show how to use Automation API to manage authorizations. Daniel, please go ahead.
Thank you, Trini, for that introduction. For this section of our webinar, we're going to cover the new config authorization endpoints added to the Control-M Automation API in version 9.0.21. Let's say that we need to add permissions for developers so they can modify jobs in our development environment. To achieve our goal, we'll create a new role and add it to a user. Note that roles are the new name for what was previously called groups in earlier versions of Control-M. Furthermore, we want to configure this programmatically from a command line. We can use the Automation API to do this through the CTM utility. First, let's make sure the CTM utility is configured to connect to our 9.0.21 Enterprise Manager. We'll issue the CTM environment show command to check for this. Good, the current environment is our 9.0.21 EM. Now we'll check which authorization roles already exist with the config authorization roles get endpoint. We currently have 3 roles: team leader, viewer, and admin. Now we want to add our role based on viewer. Let's save it to a file so we can use it as a template for our new role. To do this, we'll use the config authorization role get endpoint, passing in the name of the role, and we'll redirect the output to a file, which I'll name newrole.json. Here's the file with our exported role. Note that the Automation API uses the JSON format for data. I've copied this role ahead of time to a new file, devrole.json, and made some changes. Here is a diff between the files. On the left side, we have the original viewer role, and on the right side, our new dev role. As you can see, I've changed the role name from viewer to dev and updated the description. I've also amended the folder access privileges. Here I've added update permissions to all folders with dev in their name using wildcards around dev. And here I've left browse permission for all folders, again using a wildcard to match all folders. Now we want to upload this modified role JSON back to the EM. Going back to the CTM utility, we'll use the config authorization role add endpoint to do this, passing in the name of the new JSON we created. Good, that succeeded. Now let's check the list of roles again to make sure. We'll run config authorization roles get again. Great, we see our dev role has indeed been added. Now we want to add this role to a user. First, we'll retrieve the list of users with config authorization users get. we see we have two users, EM user and dev. We'll copy the dev user to a file with config authorization user get, passing in the name of the user and redirecting the output to a file, user.json. Note that we're using the user endpoint, singular this time, instead of users, plural, endpoint in the previous call. Here's the user.json file with our user. I'll modify the roles section of the user to add the new dev role. Next, we'll save the file and go back to the CTM utility to upload our change. I'll update the user with config authorization user update, passing in the name of the user and the user.json file with a new user definition. Success. Let's check the user to make sure. We'll run config authorization user get again. Good. We see the dev role has been added to the user. Roles can be updated similarly. You can also delete roles and users. For more details, please visit the Automation API documentation link attached to this webinar. Now, many of you viewing this webinar may be wondering, how do I deal with external authentications such as LDAP or SAML instead of EM users? The API has you covered. The mapping from external groups to EM roles can also be managed through the Automation API. But before we dig into that, there's something we need to discuss. In version 9.0.21, the config authorization LDAP endpoints have been deprecated because they've been replaced with the config authorization organization group endpoints, which have similar functionality but support both LDAP and SAML 2.0 IDP. If you've been using the config authorization LDAP endpoints, please migrate to the new organization group endpoints. The LDAP add and delete endpoints were moved under the authorization role endpoints, and the LDAP get endpoint is now under organization group. Now that we covered that, let's see some of the things we can do with organization groups. As an example, let's say we want to check the list of EM role mappings to organization groups. We can use the config authorization organization group roles get endpoint. Here we see that the EM client users LDAP group is mapped to the viewer role in Control-M. Another thing we can check is the authorizations for a user in an organization group. This is through the config authorization organization group simulate endpoint. This endpoint combines all the authorizations of the roles the user is a member of, mapped through all organization groups the user is a member of. I'll test this out with the Dan Levy user and save the output to a file for easier viewing. Here is our saved danlevy.json file. We can see all the calculated permissions of the Dan Levy user and make sure that their permissions are assigned properly. These are just some of the new API endpoints added to Control-M 9.0.21 for authorization management. Full documentation of these and more can be seen in the Automation API link attached to this webinar. This concludes this section of the demonstration. Back to you, Trini.
Thank you, Daniel, for showing how to manage authorizations via API. Next up, Drew will demonstrate how to move roles from one environment to another and then configure LDAP in Control-M Web. Drew, please go ahead.
Thank you, Trini, for that introduction. In this demo, we will be covering the following: exporting and importing Control-M roles, and configuring LDAP with Windows Active Directory and Control-M Web. Today, I will look at a scenario where a new application team under Human Resources is being set up for testing. Now, as a Control-M administrator, I have already created a role for this team in my test environment called Process New Employees, and gave it the necessary permissions and access they need. I need to create the same role in our Control-M production environment, but I don't want to create it from scratch. In Control-M 9.21, we have a way to export the role in JSON from one environment to the other. Let's take a look to see how we can use this feature to export the Process New Employees role from my test environment to my production environment. From the Control-M Web homepage, we can navigate to the Configuration tab, and from the dropdown, we'll open the Roles tab, and here we can see all our defined roles listed. Let's take a look at the Process New Employees role we are going to be exporting. We see here that it has access to these 4 interfaces. If we go to Access Control, we can see planning and monitoring is enabled with the following permissions. Under Planning, this user has browse-level access to all folders belonging to this Control-M server. And under Monitoring, it is assigned access to all job actions and job views. Now we can select the role we would like to transfer and click the Export button in the top right. We can see the JSON export file has been downloaded successfully. And if we open this up, we can see the permissions we defined before are now saved correctly in this export file. Let's open up the resulting file and have a quick look at the JSON format for the exported role. We can see here the allowed jobs, allowed job actions, and the privileges we noted before in the web. Now let's log into our destination environment where we will be importing the role that we exported earlier. If you notice in this environment, currently there are only 3 roles that are created by default when you perform a new installation. If we click Import at the top right, we can see that our export process new employees.json file will be there. We can select this and click Open to import it. Now we can see the process new employees role appears in the list and can be modified if needed. We also see that it has the same permissions that it had originally in the test environment. Roles can also be imported and exported from the command line or via script using the Control-M automation API, as Daniel showed earlier. With authorizations moving to Control-M Web in 9.21, the LDAP configuration was also moved to the web interface. Now we will cover how to integrate LDAP authentication with Control-M Web in version 9.21. On the right side, under How To, there is a link to our documentation on configuring Active Directory LDAP as well. For now, I will demonstrate these steps. Here in Control-M Web, under the Configuration tab, click this dropdown and select System Settings. As you can see here, we also support integration with Identity Provider. This was the topic of one of our previous videos. The link to that webinar can be found in the links section. Now we can take a look at the LDAP configuration panel. We can see that it is currently enabled by the toggle switch on the right. Now our next step is to define the domain. We can do this by clicking the plus button. And once we've entered our domain, we can go ahead and click Add. Now it's time to define the LDAP directory search user and their password. This is a user that will be used to search the Active Directory domain during authentication. Please note that the LDAP directory search user has to be defined in the format we see here. Your LDAP administrator will provide this information to you. By default, the communication protocol is set to TCP, and we will be selecting the Active Directory server type. Here we can define the LDAP server hostname and the port. And we will use the default LDAP port 389. Lastly, we will define the LDAP directory search base. This is the location in the Active Directory where the search user will start. This information will also be provided by your LDAP administrator. We recommend not putting the search base too high in the hierarchy of your Active Directory to avoid the amount of searching the search user has to do whilst trying to authenticate your LDAP user. Now that we have our LDAP integration configured, we can see that I am now able to log in with the user under the CWCM domain. This concludes my demo. Now back to you, Trini.
Thank you, Drew, for showing how to configure LDAP and move roles between environments. All right, everyone, that concludes our session for today. On behalf of Mike, Daniel, Drew, and the entire Connect with Control-M team, thank you for spending some time with us today. We look forward to you taking advantage of these features in your environment. Stick around for the Q&A session where we will take your questions. But first, you can learn more about the BMC education course, Fundamentals Administering, by clicking the link in the link section below, or you can visit the bit.ly link you see on the screen. Your feedback shapes our future webinars. We would appreciate if you will take a moment and answer a few questions for us in the survey that you will receive later today. You can find Control-M on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Links for each can be found in the links section below. You can watch previous webinars on the Control-M channel on YouTube. Today's webinar will be posted there within a couple of days. Let's kick off the Q&A. As a reminder, you can enter your questions on the Ask a Question section at any time.